Okay, so my name's Amanda Bennett. I am the Agriculture and Natural Resource Educator with Ohio State University Extension, and I'm based in Miami County. And I've been a beekeeper for about 8 years now. My sister and I keep a small number of hives. We both have full-time jobs, and you'll find that beekeeping is not just putting a box out and collecting some honey occasionally through the year. It is a little bit more hands-on. To be a good beekeeper and manage your bees properly, it does require some time. So we've managed anywhere from 2 to, I think we were up to 6 at our highest point. And that is really kind of what we can manage ourselves. So, but we really enjoy it. And when I came to Extension, there was really not a lot of people directly involved in beekeeping. And so I kind of took that on. All right. Well, today we're going to learn and look at just honeybee biology. We're going to look at the class structure and a little bit more. We'll also learn about pheromones and the role that they play in the hive and why they're vital for honeybee survival. And I'll share with you some different ways to obtain honeybees if you haven't already. And we'll also look at honeybee foraging behavior and what they require for nutrition. And lastly, I'm going to share some ways that you can protect pollinators and how you can enlist the help of your neighbors, friends, family, and community to do their part in protecting pollinators and ultimately the diversity of our food that we enjoy today. So first, I'm going to launch this polling question because I'm kind of interested to see how many of you currently have bees. There's 2 questions. Hopefully that popped up and you can kind of, yeah, okay, so we got some people answering, great. Just if you have bees and maybe how long you've been keeping them. Oh, great, I love it when technology works. This is my first time using this particular aspect of Zoom, so give that just about a minute or so for everybody to respond. Looks like so far the majority of you have been keeping bees for less than a year. And many of you are just still thinking about keeping bees. Excellent. And that's kind of the way, in my experience, this group has kind of been that many of the participants had never kept bees, and we're still thinking about it. So that's good that you're doing your research before you kind of jump in. That's excellent. All right, we'll go ahead and stop that. If you guys can see that, looks like many of you are still thinking about it, and the majority, almost 80%, have been keeping bees for less than a year. So great, great. So well, let's get started since you're interested in learning about to keep bees and what to do. Maybe contrary to popular belief, honeybees are not native to North America. They arrived here as early as 1622. It was documented on a ship manifest from the Council of the Virginia Company of London's. There are records that indicate there were several colonies that had arrived from England to Virginia as early as 1622. I just find that amazing. And further records show that many additional shipments took place in the 1630s, and we can kind of safely assume that they kind of spread from there. We have records indicating that they were in Ohio from 1788. And Thomas Jefferson even wrote about honeybees in some of his writings, and the Native Americans called them white man's flies. Although they're not native to the US, there were some stingless bees that were native to the West Indies and Central and South America, and they were used by early Indians in these areas. So this is hopefully one example of an introduced insect that kind of ends with a positive story. Although in recent years, you know, that ending has been much debated as we kind of see some honeybee death and some of the complications that they're going through right now. So honeybees are social insects, and that really sets them apart from a lot of different insects. Many are not social, they live by themselves, but honeybees are. They are social. They exhibit this cooperative brood care, meaning they all work together to care for the young, and that is also very unique. A lot of other insects just have like a female that cares for all the young, and most of the time actually lays eggs and doesn't even survive to see her offspring uh, hatch and go through that whole process. So that's very unique to a limited number of insects, and honeybees being one of them. So they also have a very distinct reproductive division of labor. We're going to talk about that. And they also have overlapping generations that live side by side. And that's different as well, since like I was just talking about, you know, some queens or some females don't even live until their offspring hatch or you know, start to develop from an egg. So that is kind of unique. So honeybees' Latin name is Apis mellifera, and there are 3 types of honeybees that make up the colony. We have the queen bee. Most people are familiar with that. We have worker bees, and we have the drones. The females of the hive are divided into this caste system. We have the queen and the worker. So all the workers are female. The males are known as drones, and these 3 castes of honeybees have differences in their biology, their labor responsibilities, and their brood cycle. So we'll kind of explore that in the coming slides here. First, I talk about drones. They're the males in the colony. In terms of biology, they have much larger eyes. And they're larger in general. But they have larger eyes. They have these barrel-shaped bodies. Their eyes are about twice as big as their female counterparts in the hive. And they also have these longer, thicker antennae. These drones cannot sting. They lack the anatomical structure to do so. Drones are actually the result of a queen that lays an unfertilized egg, which means they only have the DNA from the queen of the hive to pass on to future generations. And this is why the colony invests in them. They're only raised for reproduction so that the genetics of the queen are passed on. So that's why the colony invests in them and are interested in keeping them alive. And as we move through this, the biology and the cycle is really important for you to understand as a beekeeper, because when you're going and making your inspections, having this knowledge that I'm going to present today is going to help you understand what's happening in the hive. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of go and look and see, oh, that's different than last time, something like that. And you're not going to be able to read the clues and to understand and get a perspective on what's happening, so that you either know how to react, so that you know if things are going well, if things are not going well, and if action needs to be taken by you as the beekeeper. Because, you know, well, these insects have lived for obviously, you know, since the beginning. You know, they can do it on their own, but they don't live in boxes like we keep them in. So we are artificially keeping them in these boxes, and it presents just a whole nother layer of just their kind of management. In fact, bees are considered livestock. So kind of think of yourself as, you know, a manager of bees. You're not just a keeper, you're a manager. And this information is really going to help you make decisions in the hive that is going to either pay off or not be so good in the long run. So that's kind of why we're going through this at the beginning here. So drone brood are easy to identify on the frame, and brood is that name for that those developing eggs and larvae and the pupating parts. That's kind of just the young is referred to as brood. So they're really easy to identify on the frame. The caps of the cells are domed in order to allow for sufficient room for developing larvae. Typically, the drone brood are laid on the edges of the frame because they seem to thrive in temperatures that are just a couple degrees cooler than worker brood. They spend about 6.5 days as a larva, and the cells are then capped and they pupate. And they emerge fully developed. That's at about the 24-day mark. So it takes about 24 days for them to completely go from egg to emerging adult. And for the first couple of days of their adult life, the worker bees actually feed them. They learn to then feed themselves, but are often found kind of begging for food in the hive. Drones cannot forage for their own food. They don't produce any wax. They don't clean the hive. They don't guard the hive. And for this reason, they're really seen as an expense once mating season is over, or during times of drought or insufficient food supply. You'll often see drones dead at the front of your hive. You'll see them getting kicked out. They eventually just kind of also kind of starve to death because they don't feed themselves. So I find that kind of interesting, just the way things work in the hive. I've put a picture up here, those kind of domed caps. I don't think you can see my mouse maybe. But kind of in the middle there are some domed caps we see in this picture. I actually don't see any drones walking around. These are all worker hives, but then these are kind of like translucent cells. Oh, good, you see my cursor. Great. Okay. The cells like this are developing larvae. So we can kind of tell from right here that we got some larvae developing. And then eventually those will get capped, whether they're workers or drones. And that'll kind of depend upon well, what they are. And that's the way they'll be capped. So over here we have worker caps. We can tell because they're flat. And then the domes of the drones there. So about 1 week after drone adults emerge from their cells, their flight muscles develop. And during mating season, they begin their flights to what are known as drone congregation areas. And I'll explain those a little bit later, but this is where the mating happens. The number of drones in the hive, therefore, kind of fluctuates depending upon the time of year. So in the spring, there are more drones because they're gearing up for mating season. But by fall, drone production slows way down. And during the summer months, particularly during what beekeepers refer to as dearth or drought, or just a time when not many things are flowering, the older drone larvae can actually be removed and literally eaten to conserve protein and conserve resources, or to provide protein and conserve resources. So workers really regulate the number of drone brood in the colony, although the queen, she'll slow down her production at that fall time. And actually by fall time, it all but stops. And any remaining drones are literally kind of forced out of the hive during that fall time and literally die of starvation or exposure. So we see that the queen, you know, she is often referred to as, you know, the leader of the hive, and she is, you know, life kind of centers around the queen. But workers can also help regulate how often or how much brood is being kind of developing in the hive at a time. So like I said, if we run into a drought or something, you might see workers literally chewing the caps off of drone brood, extracting that pupating insect and either eating it, getting rid of it, depending upon how old it is. So next we have the worker bees. These are all female bees, but they're a different caste than the queen. Their stinger is actually a part of the reproductive structure that is underdeveloped, which is why the males don't have it. But the worker bees do. And in the absence of a queen, they can lay eggs. But these female workers are unmated, so they can only lay unfertilized eggs. So they can only lay drone brood. So if you're inspecting a hive and you see only drone brood, you're going to know right away that you have a laying worker bee, and the queen is either dead or she left or she's too old to produce and should be replaced. So these are some things that we can kind of look for as a beekeeper to begin to understand what's happening in the hive. So as far as development, in the hive, the queen inserts her head into each individual cell and can determine what size it is. And based on that information, she can either lay an egg, a fertilized egg, or an unfertilized egg. She lays the egg in the bottom of the cell. You see this picture here. Each egg is perfectly kind of in the center of the bottom right here. She releases the egg in the bottom. She releases sperm from her spermatheca to fertilize it if it's going to be a female. And if the cell is adequate size, so it's just a tad bit bigger, she's going to lay an unfertilized egg, which is going to result in that drone brood, like I said. The eggs are held upright. If you kind of picture this kind of 3D, it's actually kind of like 3D at the bottom even too, that kind of like a upside down pyramid in the bottom. So she lays that egg right there in the center, and she kind of puts it upright with some sort of kind of cement, kind of unsure about that. But they're always laid in directly at the bottom of the cell, and it stands upright. She only lays one per cell. So if the egg is laying on the side of the cell wall, like over here, or if there are multiple eggs per cell, this could be the sign of a laying worker. And that's going to clue you in right away that, you know, you have a situation that needs to be handled. Honeybees undergo what is known as complete metamorphosis. They go from an egg to adult. And this is kind of a cross section where I think you can see this just a little bit better. So the workers spend 3 days as an egg and 6 days as a larva, so just a half a day less than a drone. And it takes 12 days for them to fully pupate. So their total lifespan, or their total kind of development, is 21 days. So here is the cross section of the egg. You can see it kind of standing straight up. It is smaller than a grain of rice. When you're inspecting it, it's often helpful to have either the sun at the back of, like, kind of to the back of you to kind of shine in there. Helpful. Then after 3 days, it's going to kind of fall over, and it kind of turns into a larva right here. That's what we see here. As it's fed, it grows into a larger larva, and then even a larger larva. And then at that point, it's going to be capped by the other worker bees. And then it's going to develop. You'll see, this is the point, actually, this part of development, when you'll see some that those drones being pulled out. Sometimes if it's a time that they need to do that, you'll be seeing them pull it out at this stage of development. And then this is almost ready to emerge right here. So the development, the 21 days, it can be affected by the season, or the availability of food, or the temperature, or even colony health. But generally, these are pretty good guidelines. Worker bees, they're the workhorses, as their name suggests, of the hive. They each have tasks that change with age, but they're flexible, and they switch tasks if needed. When they first emerge as adults, they beg for food from the other worker bees. Then she's going to eventually venture out of the hive further to find, out into the hive to find that stored pollen, which we'll see in a couple slides about the stored pollen. And this protein-rich food really helps her glands mature for future tasks. Now, other worker bee tasks include cleaning cells of the cocoons and the frass of the droppings of the feeding larva. And this is the job of what we consider a nurse bee, the one that takes care of the young. They also might have tasks such as taking nectar from foragers of the hive. When the workers are approximately 12 days old, they begin to, their glands are developed enough for them to be able to produce wax, and they begin to build comb. Wax is excreted as this clear liquid from a gland on the underside of their abdomen, and the liquid cools and it becomes kind of a moldable flake. And the beekeeper can sometimes see these flakes on the bottom of the bottom board of the hive. They'll often drop off. They won't get used. Maybe there's something wrong with them or something, and they just need to discard them. So you'll often see flakes of wax at the bottom of your hive. This is just a picture of a bee emerging. You'll see these, and often as you're inspecting your hives, you'll see, bees being born. It's kind of fun. So another important job of the worker bees is a guard bee. They utilize this scent that the colony has to determine whether or not an approaching bee is a member of that colony. Now, for the beekeeper, these are the bees that are going to cause you the most problems during an inspection. They're drawn to our face by our eyes and our breath. So if you're being kind of attacked, it's best to kind of out of sight, to walk to some tall shrubs or brush if you have them nearby to kind of confuse them. You really can't use something like a smoker at that point because they can see you. So you're kind of given the game's up at that point. But at any given time, there can be grid to guard bees on duty, depending upon the situation, and more can be recruited by an alarm, others in the colony to defend it. And in addition to these cleaners, these foragers, these guards, there are many unemployed bees in the hive at any one time. They're resting, maybe there's no bees to feed, there's no comb to build, and they're just kind of milling about. So moving on, perhaps the most important job of a worker bee is that of a forager or a field worker, sometimes they're called. And these are going to be the older workers. They're usually about 3 to 4 weeks old. They're going to serve, they might serve as a scout bee who's looking for new sources of nectar, pollen, or water, or they might have been recruited to a source by another bee. They either gather nectar, pollen, water, or propolis, which we'll talk about later, but usually not at the same time. Although they can carry pollen and nectar at the same time because they do so in different parts of their body. During the warm seasons, they typically live only about 6 weeks because they often literally wear out. If you think about the little insect and the distance they fly, oftentimes their wings literally just wear out. And it's a big scary world for a tiny insect. You know, they can get eaten by a bird, they get stepped on by somebody like us. It's kind of a little bit scary out there for a little insect. Now let's take a look at the queen and how she develops and what's kind of different about her. Queen bees mature in just about 15 and a half to 16 days. So a hair bit by a couple days shorter than the others, and even about 10 days shorter than so their cells are larger because she develops into a larger bee, and it's typically a peanut shape loosely. It kind of opens at the bottom. You see a hand kind of holding this right here. This would be the opening right here at the bottom of this, this queen cell. So you'll notice she spends 3 days as an egg. That's kind of important. We've noticed that the drones, the workers, and the queen spend 3 days as an egg. Spends pupa and then emerges in about 15 and a half to 16 days. Now, as far as a beekeeper, we can see queen cells being developed at any time. They can be found on either sides of the frame. There can be multiple queens developing at the same time, even 2 or 3 or up to 20. And if these, get used and go through the pupating stage, the first one to emerge will usually kill the other rival queens as they emerge. And she often has help from her sisters in the hive. So we'll get to that a little bit when we get to mating, but there are these kind of sister groups because a queen mates with multiple drones during her flight. And so therefore you're going to have like these little sister groups or bee families sometimes. And these are born of the queen and they're the same drone sperm. So if there's a situation where a couple queens come out at the same time, she often is going to get help from her sisters to kill the others. Rarely an older queen and a daughter can coexist for a time. That's really good for the colony because it really increases egg production and it's a good benefit, but eventually the older queen is going to die. So that is usually a very temporary situation. So when the virgin queen emerges, she matures and she's fed by the other bees, and those are often called attendant bees. She then takes her orientation flight to prepare for her mating flight. So she sights landmarks along the way to ensure she can make it back to the hive safely. And I want to kind of take a moment here to explain the markings that you'll often see on queens. Here you see 3 pictures of queens with different colored dots on their thorax, and the color corresponds to the year that the queen was born. It's an internationally accepted color code by all beekeepers. So this first one here, it's years ending in a 1 or a 6 are colored with a white color. Years ending in 2 or 7 are yellow. If it ends in a 3 or an 8, it's red. This one right here, if it ends in a 4 or a 9, it's green. So if I'm getting in a hive and I see a queen with a green dot on her back, knowing that queens usually only live about 2 or 3 years, I highly doubt she was born in 2014, so she's probably going to be born in 2019 is what I'm going to deduce from that. And then years ending in a 5 or a 0 are blue. So any queen that you buy that is marked this year should be marked with a blue mark on her thorax. Other ones you might see a number on the back, and those are like researchers or queen maters that want to keep track of specific breeds and get some data back about that. So as a hobby beekeeper, you're probably going to be getting something that is colored on the back like this. Make sure to ask your source as well. You know, do they follow the code? That way you can kind of have that in your mind, because you might get a source that, you know, only has a pink marker and does all of them pink. So just make sure you kind of ask that question. But that can be helpful when you have multiple hives and you can't remember, you know, when you got them. Or it can be helpful when you're in there and you know you have, you know, a blue marked queen, and in a year from now or a couple months from now, you find the queen, but she doesn't have a mark on her. And that's usually where she's been replaced. So, or that can be a sign that she's been replaced. Often, it doesn't often wear off. They are pretty good at sticking on there. So let's get to mating. So honeybee mating happens in what I referred to earlier as drone congregation areas, these DACs, and these are typically 30 to 300 feet in the air, usually above an open field or a forest clearing. And they're the same place every year. And the fact that the drone dies right after mating and the queen only mates once, it's kind of confusing as to how they know where these are. I mean, this is a phenomenon that's not really well understood, but we know that it exists. So the queen emits this pheromone to entice drones to mate with her. The fastest drone basically catches her. He inserts his reproductive apparatus and then falls and dies, and leaves this kind of mating sign behind. And the next drone removes it and inserts his own. So the queen mates with anywhere from 2 to 5 drones per flight over a period of several days, for an average about 12 to 20 partners in total. Now, the more partners she has, the better for genetic diversity. But factors such as bad weather during mating season is going to lead to less genetic diversity as she mates with less drones, and not enough sperm to sustain her lifetime. Since she only does this once in her lifetime, you know, she might run out of sperm or and not have enough. So then she's going to probably be replaced. Someone asked what kind of paint you market with. They have specific paints. Often you can buy from a beekeeping equipment retailer that is kind of like a pen, and you can kind of mark it very easily on the thorax. So that's kind of the basics of mating there. These pheromones that are emitted by the queen also is what leads to the uniting of a colony. It's often referred to as the colony uniting scent, especially after she's mated. The virgin queens produce some amount of these so that others won't lay eggs in the hive and that no more queens are developed. So this pheromone kind of suppresses that urge by any workers to lay eggs. And after mating, the queen produces this scent so that the others in the hive can smell her. It's produced in glands near her mouth parts, and it's made up of about 17 different chemicals, so it's quite complex. And as she gets older, the amount is reduced. And when this happens, a couple other things can happen. So when it's reduced over time or she gets older, that's going to signal different things in the colony. It's going to signal that she's old. It's going to signal that maybe she's not there. And bees can know within 24 hours that the queen is not there. They can smell it. And it's going to kind of signal them to do a couple different things. So one of the first things that might happen is that the colony can swarm. And this happens when the colony is overcrowded and that pheromone is reduced simply by overcrowding. There's not enough to go around, and it's a telltale sign of the beginning stages of a swarm is the presence of these queen cell cups on the bottom of the frames. These are often referred to as swarm cells themselves. They always develop on the bottom of the frames. We can see here, just kind of point of reference, it looks like all this is worker brood because it's flat. And then we have what, about 10 of these swarm cells developing on the bottom. Now, they often do this just to kind of practice too. Sometimes like you can see these at any time of the year, but when you have that many, you want to be, and if you know it's springtime, you're going to be thinking, they're getting crowded. They're interested in swarming. And so that's your signal as the beekeeper to fix that situation, because the last thing you want to do is invest hundreds of dollars in these things and they swarm and you lose half of your colony. So, but what's happening if they are preparing to swarm, what's happening is the queen is going to slow down her egg production. She's going to be fed less. And in just about 3 or 4 days, she's going to stop laying eggs, and her body is literally going to slim down, so that enables her to fly. So normally, you know, she's pretty plump, she can't fly, but it's going to, this kind of force her not eating and being slimmed down is going to enable her to fly. Foragers are going to stop looking for food and they're going to start looking for a new home. They're going to gorge themselves on honey in preparation for the move. And when the larva is ready to be capped and pupate, the old queen leaves. The scout bees kind of scurry around. They stir up the colony. They get everybody ready to go. The queen, some drones, and thousands of workers will literally pour out of the hive. And the remaining bees, they carry on as if nothing has happened. They forage, they ripen the nectar, and a newly mated queen starts laying eggs. But there's going to be a period of time from when the virgin queen emerges, she gets mated, and she starts to lay eggs. So that's really important to know as a beekeeper also about time of year. So we talked earlier about the drones are really only available, or in the number they need to be available is in the springtime, because that is mating season. So if you're seeing this happen in July, that's a problem, because a queen is not going to get mated properly in July. There's not enough drones out there, and that's going to be a problem. So all this kind of beekeepers' knowledge of a brood cycle and when things normally happen is really going to help you be a successful beekeeper. Another reason we might see queen cells develop is during supersedure, and that's the process that happens either when the queen is lost, she might be injured, she could be crushed, she could be diseased, and the workers are going to choose the youngest larva that's under 3 days old, that's still being fed this really rich diet often called royal jelly. Worker bees and queen bees are going to be fed this royal jelly when they're under 3 days old, so that they really can kind of develop. And then after that 3-day mark, worker bees get a kind of reduced diet, and queen bees are continued to be fed royal jelly so that they can have enough nutrients to develop into the queen bee that they're going to be. So for this reason, in this kind of emergency situation, the cells could be on any part of the frame. They're looking for eggs that are under 3 days old, the youngest larva, the larva, not eggs, larvae that are under 3 days old, and that way they can kind of be put anywhere. So it just depends on where they're at. And there's really no, the queens don't always lay in lines and things like that, so they can be kind of scattered everywhere. But here are 2 examples of what we might think are supersedure cells right here, or kind of these emergency cells. They're different than those swarm cells where we saw that they're on the bottom. So when I started buying, or when I started beekeeping, this was kind of one of my first questions. Where do you buy bugs? Of course, I've come a long way since then because first of all, I know that honeybees are not bugs, they're insects. And there is a difference. But second, now I know how to buy bees. So one of the most obvious ways might be to buy an already established colony or hive. Maybe you've talked with a neighbor or a friend or someone online that's interested in getting out of the business. But this is probably not the way I would recommend new beekeepers to get into, beekeeping, because there are multiple drawbacks for this method of obtaining bees. First has to do with like the market value of an already established hive. It's difficult to understand or predict, so you might end up paying, too much, or I guess not enough, but it's just kind of a little bit difficult. In addition, disease and pest presence can be a concern. You don't know if you're buying somebody else's problems. Also, the condition of the equipment might not be the best. The longer the equipment is in use, it gets dirty, it gets more worn, the frames get black, the honeycomb darkens, and that's probably just not something that you want to start with. And also, buying an established colony can be really difficult to manage for a novice beekeeper. We've got swarm prevention that you have to be watching for, disease management, pests that you just might not be prepared to handle. And so therefore, it's not usually the way that I recommend new people to get started. We are going to talk about nukes in just a minute. Another way to obtain bees is to acquire a swarm, okay? This is usually done in the spring, when the natural swarming season is in full swing. Remember, I said it was kind of in the spring when these things tend to happen. The swarms include that queen, lots of worker bees who have left their hive due to overcrowding and are seeking a new home. They send out scout bees to look for a new home, and depending upon the length of time to find a suitable habitat, swarms can be in place for a few hours up to 24 hours or more, and that is often unpredictable. Local beekeepers associations usually maintain a list of members that are willing to come and retrieve swarms. Oftentimes people will call their local extension office when they find a swarm, and I'll refer them to the local beekeepers association. You as a novice beekeeper could get involved with the local association and get yourself on the list to obtain a swarm should a call come in. Also contact your local extension office, tell them that you're interested in being on the list as well. Beekeepers can collect them in a variety of ways depending upon the physical location of the swarm, and this can be fairly easy if they're swarmed on something like a low-hanging branch, or it can be very high and require large equipment to retrieve. In my 8 years of collecting swarms, I've gotten a few calls. A couple times I was ready to go out the door and they called and said that it was gone already. One time I got really lucky and it was at my neighbor's house, but it was in a mature tree about 50 feet off the ground. So luckily I'm a farm kid and I live close to the family farm, and I have access to lots of equipment, including a large boom. So I cut the branch off using the boom. I cut the branch off and shook the bees into a cardboard box, and I was able to then transfer them to an empty brood box that I had. So that's another good point. If you're interested in catching swarms, it's very handy to have some additional brood boxes on hand, additional equipment that you're not using for such an occasion. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting on your Amazon shipment to bring you more equipment, meanwhile having bees in a box or something. So not an ideal situation. If you want to catch swarms, make sure you have the extra equipment on hand. And then here we get to nukes, and buying a nucleus is a different way to obtain bees, and it usually consists of about 5 frames that come either in a cardboard box or a corrugated cardboard box, like a plasticky type. It consists of a mated queen. It has bees, it has drawn frames, a foundation, usually with resources in them like honey and pollen and brood. The queen will have typically been laying for a minimum of 1 month. And these are usually obtained locally from a local breeder. And the question somebody had asked was, do I consider a nuke an established colony? No, I don't. A nuke is only 5 frames, where I would say what I was referring to as an established colony is, 2 brood boxes full of bees that are just like ready to go. You know, a nuke is much smaller, only 5 frames, and they have a lot to do. One word of caution is to make sure that when you're getting a nuke is to make sure that your equipment is compatible to what they have. So make sure you're both, you know, running the same type of equipment. So don't buy a nucleus from a breeder that might only run 8 frames and you run 10. Just kind of be aware of that. Make sure you have the same kind of equipment. Otherwise, you're going to kind of end up with a little bit of a mess. One of the easiest ways to obtain bees might be to buy packages from a bee breeder. They usually come in pounds, either in 3 or 5 pounds, but most commonly 3 pounds. They're typically from southern breeders, so they breed them in the southern states and ship them up here. And these bees come in a screened box. This is one example right here. They come in something like this. This is full of bees. It has this opening right here where often an inverted can with some sugar water is their food source while they're being shipped. And then the queen comes little tiny cage, just about the size of maybe your middle finger, not very big. It's got a screen on it so attendant bees can feed her. Remember, she doesn't feed herself. And then it usually is plugged on the end. It has a hole and it's plugged on the end with a piece of candy. Eventually she's released from that cage, but she's mated, she's caged. This could be a cheaper option than buying a nucleus, but be wary. You know, you might get what you pay for. Just be cautious of that. This is typically you would kind of shake them in the top of a new box and then just leave here for them, the rest of them, to kind of find it. Remember, the queen, she produces that scent, so they can easily find her and go into the hive there. So as you might see, buying bees is not exactly straightforward, but I want to share with you the most common ways kind of side by side, and that's the nukes and the packages. In terms of availability, packages trump nukes. This is due to the fact that the nukes are highly sought after and are highly dependent upon winter survivability of local breeders. So sometimes local breeders can be really hard to find, and word of mouth seems to be the best way to find out about their existence. Also, being in contact with a local beekeeping association will help you in that search, because oftentimes local beekeepers will know who is breeding bees and selling them. But another advantage to nukes would be that they're from local breeders, whereas packages come from those southern states. And some beekeepers think that overwintering can be an issue. However, just the availability of packages, a lot of associations do group orders, so they might be more affordable and might be more easily obtainable. I've done it both ways. I tend to like to support my local economy a little bit. I like to have those local bees. I am kind of the thought that you know, local bees that have survived, a queen that survived our winters might be a little bit ahead of a queen that comes to us from Georgia or somewhere like that, that is not going to have the same type of weather. But I've definitely done it both ways. I don't feel like I've necessarily had any more success with a nuke overwintering than a package. But that is something that I think is maybe in people's minds and on their radar that might be an issue. But like I said, nukes are sold out very quickly in the year, and packages generally never sell out. So if you're in a situation, especially if you're just thinking about getting bees this year, you might have to get a package. There might not be any nukes available. And oftentimes you'll order a nuke in January, February, maybe even sooner than that, but you're not going to actually know if you're going to get it until April, May even, because the local breeder can't predict how many they'll actually have alive at that time. So what their winter survivability is going to be. So in terms of foraging and nutrition, bees are after kind of the big 3: pollen, nectar, and water, and sometimes propolis. And I'll go over kind of each of these. Just to look at some honeybee biology, it might be a good point to stop here and review. Oh, somebody asked about the nuke cost. That can really vary. I've seen 150 to 180. They can be quite expensive. Definitely the most expensive option probably of all of those. So worker bees have specialized parts to complete their different tasks. First off, they have this crop or this honey stomach, and it's a separate compartment ahead of their typical stomach, as we might think. This is used as a storage organ where they suck up nectar at a flower, and it's stored there as the honeybee flies back to the colony and then regurgitates it back into the hive. So that is where they store that nectar. Another point of biology of interest is the stinger. And that's the one we're most interested in staying away from, right? So the stinger is actually this modified ovipositor, the typical part of a female that is used for depositing eggs right here. And because worker bees don't lay eggs, remember, they can only do so in the absence of a queen, their ovipositor is modified into a stinger. And so that's the reason that only females can sting, that drones don't have this anatomy, so they don't have a stinger. And she usually reserves it for killing, the queen bee can sting, but she usually only reserves it for killing rival queens inside the hive. Another part of a honeybee worker is their glands on their bodies that are used to produce wax. And like I said, that's at the bottom of their thorax there. And the last part I'll point out is their pollen basket right here on their hind legs and this pollen comb. It's basically these stiff hairs on their hind legs that are used for carrying pollen back to the hive. And this capacity or this kind of biology really makes them very adept at being pollinators. They naturally need nectar and pollen, and so they're really great pollinators because they're already doing that. And they even have these specialized hairs on their legs to be able to do that. And you see they have this sucking mouth part. That's what they get their nectar with. Think of it like a long straw. So that's just kind of a different part of their biology there. Somebody asked what happens to the queen when she stings. That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't really think she uses it very often. There are a lot of interesting YouTube videos where queens sting. Because I think your question is directed at worker bees. When they sting, they usually leave their stinger behind and they die. If we think about it like that, that could be what happens to the queen. I'm not really sure. Good question, though, to find that out. The most recognizable thing that bees collect is nectar from flowers, which is produced at the base of the flower. And this substance right down here at the base of the flower. So this substance has the consistency of water, and it's stored in that honey crop of the bee and transported back to the hive. And the nectar is then kind of dried down to form what we know and recognize as honey that has a very different consistency than water. It takes a while for this to happen. So you can actually hold frames up and kind of turn them on the side and watch nectar drop out. That can be, an indication that the honey's not ready. It's obviously more of a nectar situation, so it needs to go again. Somebody says that they think that bees release their stingers when stinging mammals, but that it isn't released when stinging others. That sounds probably. Oh, thank you, Mike. Queen bees, yes, that is a point. Their stingers are smooth, whereas a worker bee's stinger has kind of this barbed aspect to it, so that queen bees could sting multiple times without losing it. And that's why the worker bees, when they do sting, it's barbed, so they can't really necessarily pull it back out. One of the things that honeybees gather as well is pollen, and this is full of protein, starch, fat, vitamins, and minerals. Interestingly enough, by weight, pollen has more than beef has in it. Because of the different sources of pollen, it can vary in color. It can be gray, yellow, orange, red, and any color in between. So that's why you see this great color variety right here. It's produced by that, let me go back, produced by this top parts of the flower. And so the bees bring it back to the hive. They push it into those cells. They use their head actually to kind of push it into the cells, pack it in. And then they cover it with this, when the cell gets full, they cover it with a thin layer of honey to preserve it. Pollen has more protein by weight than beef does. That's what I said. There was a question about that. So use those pollen baskets. This is just an example of what those pollen baskets look like. I can see this is how they come back to the hive. It's carried back to the hive. It's deposited into those cells, like I said, and it's usually stored near developing brood, so it provides easy access for the nurse bees to get to and to be able to feed to the young. As a beekeeper, you can stand by the side of the hive and watch bees bring pollen in. It's really quite fascinating. This is also an indication to the beekeeper that pollen is available and that the queen should be laying eggs. That is kind of stimulates her to start to lay eggs when you're coming out of the winter. So during the winter, she slows way down, doesn't produce any eggs at all to speak of. And then when nectar and pollen are available, you'll start to see that egg production ramp up. This can be an indication when you get a swarm. So I caught, remember I said I caught that swarm, but that doesn't mean because I put them in the box that they're going to stay in that box. So an indication to a beekeeper who has just caught a swarm and put them in a new box, and even for that matter, a package, and put them in the box, you know, you're putting that package on new or maybe old comb. It doesn't mean it doesn't guarantee they're going to stay there. But when you see pollen being brought in like a day or so later, that's an indication that they've accepted that this is a good place to live. So that is something to watch out for. You don't so much have that problem with if you buy a nuke, because they have brood there that they're already invested in that they need to protect. So they're easier to accept their new habitat than a swarm or a package. So this is an indication, if you buy it either way, a package or a swarm, that when you see pollen being brought into the hive, you'll know that they've accepted it and that they're not going to leave, because the other option is they could leave. If they find something unsuitable about the habitat, they easily could leave and try to find somewhere else. So that is something to be watching out for. Propolis is another substance that they might be gathering. And this is a microbial active resinous substance that's usually produced by trees to protect leaf and flower buds during development. Bees scrape with their mandibles. Alders, birches, willows, and other conifers are their preferred tree species. They pack it in their pollen baskets, and other bees from the hive remove it because it's really sticky. Think of this like chewing gum. It is sticky. You can see right here, this is probably a warm day where they pulled off the cover and it was stuck together, and you get this kind of chewing gum look. Think of it, everybody's got probably chewing gum on their tennis shoe before or something. That's kind of what this is like. This material is easily gathered on warmer summer days, and it's used by bees to seal up cracks in the hives. During the wintertime, drafts can be really detrimental to bees in the winter. So propolis is used to reduce this problem, to seal up cracks. You see here the entrance hole during the winter time. They will put propolis on it and just leave a small enough opening for them to get in and out. So that's how they use propolis. Another example here, just kind of what it might look like. They kind of put it a little bit everywhere. This also can get on your hands. If you don't wear gloves, this gets on your hands. It stains them yellow for a time period. So just kind of be aware of that. It's also, like I said, super sticky. So if you have some like hand sanitizer that is an alcohol base, that is really helpful when you're inspecting, because you can kind of put that on there and get the stickiness off. Because if you do it with soap and water, it doesn't come off very well. They also have other uses for it. So because of its microbial properties, they can use it for kind of sealing up anything that might be rotting in the hive. So this is an example of a mouse that has been propolised. They presumably had stung it to death. So it had got in the hive somehow. They stung it to death, and they obviously can't carry it out of the hive. So they covered it with propolis and encased it so that it didn't rot and cause a problem in the hive. So that's something else kind of interesting. I'm going to go over on my time here. You might hear a lot about bees in terms of their breeds, and truthfully, this can be really hard for a breeder to keep pure because of the nature of the drone congregation areas I was talking about. Unless the breeder uses some artificial insemination for their queen breeding, it's going to be hard for them to sell something as a purebred anything, really. As I mentioned earlier, Apis mellifera is not native to the United States, but rather it was imported by early American settlers from their homeland. And one of the first breeds of bees that were those were often referred to as German black bees or Northern European bees, and they flourished along the East Coast, but they were really hostile. They tended to sting their keepers a lot. They were prone to serious disease problems, and it was likely due to this fact that they were in a new location with different weather, different predators, other insects, new fungi, bacteria, and viruses. So it's really doubtful that any of these exist anymore. And most likely they became kind of a melting pot as other imports arrived and pests wiped the breed out. And due to all these issues with this breed, keepers were really interested in looking for another breed of bee to replace them. With improved steam technology making the voyage from Europe to the Americas faster came this wave of unregulated bee importation. And one of these imported bees was the Italian bees. And we have record of these as early as 1850s. They were among the most popular breed we have in existence today. They're a little bit more yellow in color than many of the other breeds. They overwinter a really large population compared to other breeds, and therefore they utilize more resources throughout the winter. If they do overwinter well, they're really known to do fairly well. They build up a nice population fairly quickly in the the springtime. But in periods of insufficient resources, like nectar and pollen and water, like drought times, they're really prone to robbing from other hives because of their large population. They need more resources to support them. Another type of breed that falls kind of under these Italians is the Cordovan. They're included because they're Italian bees that have been selected for this single recessive gene that determines their color. And it's the golden color, like it's pictured on the slide here. This makes the queen bee easier to see on a frame because she's a lot lighter than all the other bees. So you might see breeders that say, you know, these are Italian type bees that might have some Italian heritage or Cordovan heritage. Like I said, kind of that purebred is probably really hard to determine at this point. Another breed that you might see are the Carniolans, and these bees originate from parts of Eastern Europe. They're kind of gray or brown in color, and they're fairly conservative with their winter stores to make it last, and therefore they tend to overwinter pretty well. They're slow to construct more comb, but they do build up quickly in the springtime, similar to Italians. The drawback with this breed is they tend to swarm frequently. So for that matter, the same could really be said for the Italian. So the beekeeper that kind of chooses either of these breeds has to be a manager of swarms during the spring season. And I'll share how to kind of manage swarms in a different presentation. Caucasian bees come from the Caucasus mountain regions, and that's on the border of Europe and Asia. These bees tend to be a little bit grayer in color, and they're known to be very gentle. So for the novice beekeeper, they might be a nice choice because they don't swarm easily, but there are a little bit of drawbacks with this breed. They don't overwinter well. They're slow to build up their populations in the most critical time in springtime, and they're kind of susceptible to Zima, which is a parasitic fungi of Western honeybees. They also collect a large amount of propolis, which can be an annoyance to beekeepers. Another breed of bee that gets a lot of attention rather negatively is the Africanized bee. They're a crossbreed between an East African species and the European breeds, such as the Italians. They were imported into Brazil in the 1950s to increase honey production there, but a lot of several swarms that escaped during this kind of quarantine project that they had going on there, and they ended up mating and spreading throughout South America. We know that they made it to the US as early as the mid-1980s. They're very aggressive and they react much quicker to disturbances than other other breeds. They've been reported to chase people for tenths of a mile, so those can be problematic. And the next few breeds of bees that I'll kind of cover, they're being explored as a way to manage a parasite called the Varroa Mite. There's some interest in Russian bees because they've been coexisting with the Varroa Mite for decades and haven't been negatively impacted by them. So there's kind of an interest there. They're also highly resistant to Tracheal Mites, which is another pest of honeybees. They tend to be darker than many of the other breeds we discussed today, including the Italians. Another positive attribute of Russian bees are that they only raise brood when there are sufficient pollen to do so. So therefore, it doesn't contribute to a lot of stress. So that might be a good reason to kind of seek out Russian breeds. And the last bee breeds that I'll cover today are kind of two breeds that are being bred here in the US by researchers. The first are called Indiana leg chewers or Purdue leg chewers due to the university that's breeding them. These bees have a grooming propensity to each other. When they come across a Varroa mite, they chew the legs off the mite and it makes them fall off the bees, which is helpful. And another breed that's being explored as a way to manage some parasites and pests and disease problems is these Minnesotan hygienic queens. They're Italian in origin and they have this really highly hygienic behavior that helps reduce types of diseases such as American foul brood, chalk brood, and mites. So kind of like a little check is kind of maybe what's wrong with this picture. I know we don't have audio on here, but this is just an example of an indication where we might have a worker laying eggs. You see multiple eggs in each cell. We see them on the side because her body is not long enough to get to the very base of the cell, so she can't lay the eggs on the base like a queen can. So this might be an example of where we have a worker bee problem, laying eggs. This is just kind of identifying, you know, on a frame. This is my picture actually. You see right here the queen bee. She's a lot longer than the other bees. It's just kind of getting a handle on what she looks like. These right here are the drones. You see they have like this larger kind of like shoulder region, if you will, and you can kind of see that right here. This looks to be one right here. And then we see a lot of other workers. These are all workers right here. So just kind of getting different bees look like can be helpful. I wouldn't say you have to find the queen every single time that you're in a hive. It can be kind of comforting to a new beekeeper, but as long as you see eggs, I don't know if you see eggs standing straight up, that's a really good indication that you have a queen that has at least laid eggs in the last 3 days. So that can be a healthy beekeeper. You don't always have to find the fact if it's too long and they're open long, you know, you're going to end up with more chances to get stung and you disrupt them and things like that. So as long as you see eggs, you're good to go. Eggs in the bottom of the cells, not like the last picture that we just saw. What about this one? What do you think might be the cause of this frame? First of all, you know, what are we seeing? We see a lot of domed cap brood. In this case, as a beekeeper, I might conclude that the queen bee is either not performing or she's not present because there's so many unfertilized eggs here because there's so many capped brood. Not to mention the frame is just messy, right? It's just messy. Another one, this is an example of one that, you know, has paint on her back, but also actually has a number on her back. So we might think that yellow is that either she's born in a year that ends in 7 or 2, and that can tell you whether or not she's, you know, too old or not old enough. This is maybe not an extreme cause of an alarm. This could be a sign of a virgin queen because you see we have 2 cells here that have 2 eggs in them. However, they're at the very bottom. So this could be a virgin queen that's just kind of like getting the kinks worked out. So it might not be cause for alarm, but because they're at the bottom, we know that it's likely not a worker that is laying eggs. Just a couple diseases to be aware of as a beekeeper. One of the first one is American foul brood disease. This is caused by a bacterium that's spread through spores. And it might be the first indication that you might have this is if you open the hive and it smells like sulfur, like somewhat like a chicken house. The caps of the worker brood could be sunken or perforated. And there are a few tests that the beekeeper can perform to check for this. One is this called a ropey test. You use this fine pointed instrument like you see here in this picture. When you insert it into the cap and then pull it back, this kind of goo that might come out is the sign that you might have American foul brood disease. Unfortunately, there's not really a cure. The best way to handle this disease is to burn the entire colony, equipment, bees, everything. So prevention is really the key to this, and integrated pest management, including sanitation, like heat sanitizing your hive tools between colonies, is a good way to make sure that you don't have this. If you think you have this, you might want to call the state bee inspector. They can come out and look for these things and help you make that determination before you burn your entire colony. You don't want to do that. Somebody asked how long a queen bee lives on average. Somewhere between 2 to 3 years on average, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more. It just really kind of depends. It's a good average though. Another disease that you to be aware of is European foul brood disease, and it's caused also by a bacteria, and it's often mistaken for American foul brood disease, so they can look very similar. There are antibiotic treatments that can be used to treat this European foul brood disease, but due to the Veterinary Feed Directive Act that went into effect a couple years ago, this has to be prescribed by a veterinarian. So you have to have a relationship with the veterinarian. Another way, and a lot of veterinarians don't have bee experience, so it's been kind of this learning process. But another way to deal with this is to add brood to the colony. So donated brood, maybe add a frame of brood from another colony in here, and don't feed, supplemental feed the infected colony. So when you increase the brood to compete for resources, the attention of the nurse bee is diverted and the infected brood starved to death. It's kind of one way that some beekeepers manage this disease without antibiotic treatments. Two different types of nosema can be a problem for adult bees. This is a fungus, and it's difficult to tell between the two, but laboratories can tell if you'd like to know the difference. Serinae are more common these days. Telltale signs of nosema infections are feces on the outside of the entrances or the inner parts of the hive. And this usually shows up after periods of confinement or stress. So wintertime is kind of one of those times when we might see some nosema showed up. And this is a fungus that gets in the midgut of the bees and causes something akin to dysentery. There are products on the market that can help with this. You can administer it in the spring or the fall called Fumagellin. You want to do this in the off season of honey production because of contamination issues, but this can help mitigate this fungal pathogen. There are a number of parasites that plague honeybees. One is the Tracheal Mite, and it was found in 1984 in Texas and is believed to originate from Mexico. This mite lives in the breathing opening of the honeybee, and it essentially feeds on its blood. The mite crawls out of, it kind of crawls out and looks for a new host, usually a worker less than 3 days old, or a drone. And infestations can vary seasonally. When populations are high, the mite count usually is pretty low. So symptoms of tracheal mites, they're really subtle. You could see just kind of a general dwindling population. You might see what we call K wings, which are adult wings that are folded over the other in the abdomen that form kind of a K. But these are kind of non-specific, and they might actually be signs of other diseases, so they're really not very helpful in diagnosing that. But bees with this K wing or these tracheal mites, they can't form clusters, which results in clumps of bees on different combs, making winter survivability really unlikely. The only way to diagnose this parasite is to dissect the bee. And it's not a major pest at this point. It only represents minor losses. So we kind of tend to focus on maybe some prevention. There are some products. One is called Mite Away 2. It's a formic acid that is used as part of an IPM approach, and it's approved for honey or organic honey production. Some of these products also might be made from essential oils like thymol or eucalyptal, menthol, camphor. that treat both tracheal mites and Varroa mites, which we'll discuss next. Some beekeepers use these things called grease patties, which are a mix of granulated sugar and something like Crisco, and then you put like either wintergreen or peppermint oil as a way to prevent tracheal mites. The effectiveness of this is rather unknown at this point, just because of the difficulty in testing, but that is something that some beekeepers utilize. Probably the most problematic pest that we have for the Western honeybee is the Varroa mite. It was once only in Europe and was limited to just drone brood and didn't really affect colony life to a large degree, but now the presence of Varroa mites have spread to everywhere honeybees are, except for Australia and a few select islands. The parasite makes its home on the thorax of the honeybee. You can see one right here. It could easily be overlooked by a novice beekeeper, but every time you're in the hive, I'd just be looking for these. They're here. You will have them. It's only a matter of when. Beyond staying vigilant each time and every time you're in the hive, there are some methods you can employ to ascertain the level of infestation you might have. If you randomly pull out cap brood, that's one way to look. This is the preferred host for Varroa mites. You could use a cap scratcher, kind of looks like a fork, pull it out, look for Varroa mite that are already on the developing pupa. You can dust your frames over the top with powdered sugar. So you take like a colander or some fine sieve, put powdered sugar in it and kind of put it over the top, and the bees groom each other. And the idea is that as they groom each other, that the mite falls off to the bottom board. Also, you can buy bottom boards that have these special grids on them that you can count the number of mites on each grid. If you multiply it by 50, you can get a total population number. And that could be a good calculation of your level of infestation. So we want to keep that number under 3,000. But treatments are really the best for Varroa mites, and they range from the products that contain a hops derivative. It's called Hop Guard, to some people use essential oils or formic acid. These research on these are mixed and still kind of in process. You should definitely, should new purchased bees be mite free? If you purchase bees that have mites on them, I would be wanting my money back, or that is not okay. If you're purchasing somebody else's problem, you definitely want to check and make sure they're mite free, or I would have a serious problem with that. The reality of modern American beekeeping is that you're going to get this mite. It's only a matter of time. You have to have a plan. I've been keeping bees for about 8 years now. We've treated for mites almost every year as a preventative measure. This year, we actually did not treat for mites. We had, here in Ohio, we had a lot of wet weather in the summertime. Our bees are in an area where it's kind of difficult to get to if you have a lot of water. So we didn't get the treatment on in time, and we had a hive that died in November, and it was full of mites, most mites I've ever seen. Somebody asked, are mites bad for your honey? Theoretically, you can filter it out, because I'm sure that your customers don't want mites in their honey, and they don't want leg parts and wing parts and stuff, so you filter it anyway. What's bad, it's bad for the health of the honeybee. So not necessarily honey or honey quality, but your production is going to be reduced because basically your bees get sick. Your bees, they get sick and they can't perform like they would have performed. Another pest is the wax moth, and these are a predator of dead or weakened colonies. Anytime that you have a colony with too much comb to protect and not enough bees to protect the comb, they're in danger of succumbing to this wax moth. As they say, an ounce of prevention goes a long way, so maintaining a healthy colony with adequate numbers is a prevention control. Freeze any frames that are not being used. That's another way to kill the moth eggs and prevent them from hatching. So anytime we have a colony that's dead, anytime we have equipment that we take out of production, we put it in a deep freezer, a deep chest freezer. We have a freezer just for that a cheap $50 freezer to put in the barn, and to Make sure you don't have additional boxes when you're not needed. Don't add them to the colony when they're not needed. There's this 7 of 10 rule. If the bees are on 7 of your 10 frames, then they need another box. Don't add before. Don't add don't add before, or else they might not have enough bees to protect all that comb, and you're going to get wax moth. So that 7 of 10 rule means, you know, they're working on the comb in some way. They're either filling it with pollen, with brood, with nectar. They're drawing drawing the comb, something like that. We want them to be working on them. So what do you do if you have an infestation? It kind of depends upon when you find it. If you're in the south, we might put the super on a mound of fire ants that eat the larva and the eggs and the pupa of the wax moth. But since we're not, we have to find other ways to manage it. It's more likely that you're going to find something like these pictures. This is actually one of my hives a couple years ago. The hive had died over the winter. We couldn't get to the bee yard due to flooding when the weather started to warm, so we got there kind of late. They had no bees to protect it because they were dead, and the moths took over and completely destroyed the hive, ate all of the wax that was here. These are pupating wax moths right here. They actually burrowed into the wood, so there were indentations in the wood. It was incredible, unfortunately. And at this point, we just burned the entire thing. We're not very good woodworkers. We probably could have scraped and cleaned and all this stuff, but we just chose not to. So we just got rid of the whole thing. I think we might have kept the outer box, but not the frames. So this is what can happen. This is unfortunately, most of my examples are because of the things that I did wrong. So that's kind of an example of that wax moth. The small hive beetle is this other common nuisance type of pest that you're going to get in your hive. You can see them here in the picture. These are those small black beetles right here. You see them kind of crawling right along with the honeybees. They don't really seem to mind the honeybees a lot. They're just kind of want to try to get them away, kind of manage them, get them out of there. Because they can eat resources that you don't want them to eat. So these beetles lay eggs in the crevices and cracks in the hive, and the larvae come out and eat the resources in the hive, mostly pollen. And then they make their way out of the hive, and they actually pupate in the ground near the hive. This is a beetle that spends a part of its lifetime underground. So the adults, they emerge from the soil and crawl back into the hive and start the whole process all over again. The beetles are attracted to those resources in the hive. Obviously, this is kind of like the grocery store for them, buffet. Bees usually live synonymously with those beetles. They sometimes trap them in propolis cages or chase them away, but they're generally just kind of a nuisance to the bees. But as a beekeeper, they're a nuisance to us because they're eating resources. So there are a few ways you can manage the beetle population in a hive. First, like many of these pests, the first thing you do is maintain colony strength. You want to make sure your bees are healthy and functioning well. That is the first line of defense. Another possibility is a soil drench to the soil around the hive. However, you could kind of get some non-target insects that might have a negative effect. So some beekeepers, I've seen some blogs and things citing the use of diatomaceous earth to cut larvae so they dry up and die. But this product is rendered useless as soon as it rains. So it only works if it's dry and it has not rained. So it's probably not real effective method to utilize in Ohio. Another integrated pest management option might be a beetle trap. These are these little tiny plasticky traps that you put in between the frames, and you put vegetable oil in them. The beetles are attracted to the trap, and then they get trapped in the oil and die. A word of caution: if you use a pollen patty in the summertime to help give additional resources for the queen to kind of gear up her egg production, sometimes beekeepers will use these pollen patties. If you're using those in the early spring, then you want to be cautious that they also are a great source for small hive beetle larvae. This, unfortunately, is another example of my hive right here. We kept the pollen patty on too long, and it was a hot spot for small hive beetle larvae. So basically, just take it off, before, so it doesn't cause that problem. Lastly, I'll cover some predators. Woodpeckers can be a problem. Termites, spiders, they're all predators. Luckily, in this part of the world, we don't really need to worry about bees like beekeepers in other parts of this country. Ants are a common pest that you'll see in the hive. We have experimented with sprinkling cinnamon on the inner cover. It smells nice, like honey and cinnamon kind of smell nice together. But I'm not really, I haven't concluded that it's super effective. Skunks can eat a whole hive in one night, which is really important to have your hive elevated slightly. We'll talk about that in the next presentation about equipment. Hornets are more likely problems. They attempt to rob hives of their resources, especially during periods of insufficient resources like August. Mice also like to eat honey and comb, as do moles and shrews. Rats are often, they're too large to be a concern, but they can be problematic in certain situations. And birds like to eat drones and queens, and birds like mockingbirds and thrushes as well. So just kind of being aware of those. I'll just wrap up here with kind of some bee oddities. They are prone to drifting, which means that in a line like this, if you have your hive situated in a line like that, you might end up with the strongest colonies being on the outside edges, because they kind of just like drift. Even though they have this colony united scent, sometimes it's just, I don't know, easiest to go to the end for some reason. And so you can see colonies on the ends being a little bigger. So one way to kind of mitigate that is to not put them in a line and put them in maybe more like clusters or half like a horseshoe shape. That might help. So if you have multiple colonies, multiple hives rather, that might be a way to think about that to reduce drift. You don't want them spreading diseases from one hive to another. And know that Italians are really bad at this. Another thing I talked about is robbing. So during periods of reduced resources, you might consider putting on a screen like this. The screen has to be big enough for bees to kind of go in, but I think there's the opening right here. I've never utilized one of these myself, but it could be a problem if you have a situation like that. And then just know that if you're thinking about planting some flowers or different sources of pollen and nectar for bees, that they have these kind of this tendency to go to one species of flower and finish that all up, the resources, before they move on to a different species. So for that reason, we usually recommend planting things in clumps. So don't plant, a coneflower and an aster and a coneflower and an aster. It's better to plant all your coneflowers together, all your asters together. And that really goes away from kind of our traditional landscaping methods that we have here in the United States, kind of this Gothic thing of symmetry and things like that. Pollinator gardens they look messy and unkempt, and that is kind of for a reason. Temperatures that bees typically fly is somewhere between 50 and 80 some degrees. They really like the warmer weather. And somebody asked earlier about when to look at your hives. And that's going to be kind of the same recommendation there. The speed, so they can travel like 12.5 miles per hour. They're really fast. And even on a return trip, they can be even a little bit faster than that. And depending upon the flower size and the ability to produce nectar, they might spend 30 minutes on their flight. They might spend 2 hours on their flights, and they typically have 15 to 20 flights a day. So that can vary quite a bit. I'll stop this presentation here. So honeybees, I think they're really fascinating. They're complicated creatures. They're not easy like you might think. They've been of interest to mankind for thousands of years, and they continue to be active in our everyday life as we realize the importance of the pollinating jobs that they perform. So I will stop there, and I'm going to answer some questions here. Okay, somebody asked, should we remove excess? I'm going to say that depends. You can. Some people call different products out of propolis. If you're wanting to do that and diversify what you sell, that can be an option. They actually have propolis traps, which kind of looks like a screen that you put onto the frame, onto the hive, and they fill it with propolis, and then you take it off, you put it in your freezer, and then you, like old ice cube trays, you kind of crack it like this, and all the propolis falls out, because when it gets frozen, it becomes really brittle. So it's really easy to kind of get off of that frame. You can do that if you want to. My recommendation, as you get towards fall, you want to minimize the times that you're in the hive, because you're going to kind of crack that propolis open, and then it might not have enough time to seal again. And like I said, the drafts in the wintertime are one of the most detrimental things to honeybees. So you want to make sure that they're sealed up properly. You don't want to disrupt that. So it depends on the time of year and your goal. When do you remove the slides for honey? So right here in this picture, actually, you see this white capped right here. This is actually capped honey. When you have, I want to say about at least 2/3 to maybe 3/4 of the whole frame looks like this, it's ready to be harvested. This one is not a honey frame because it has brood right here, but if the whole frame were, if this were a honey frame, and it'd be on top of my brood boxes, and it was like I said, 2/3 to 3/4, all white, all that white capped, then I'll know it's ready for harvest. And typically here in Ohio, you can have a harvest time around the 4th of July, and again around Labor Day. Some beekeepers only harvest honey one time, so it really just kind of depends upon what your management style is. What ours has been is we typically harvest there in July because we have enough, and then whatever they collect from July until September, we leave on for the winter time for them. The best time to check a honeybee hive, the warmest part of the day, actually. So get on that big suit that you have and get all hot and sweaty, because you want to do it during the warmest part of the day. That is when the most bees are going to be out of the hive, so you have less bees to deal with. And you do not want to be checking if it is overcast, if it is raining. Do not open that hive. You're going to open yourself up to more problems. You're going to be not only get the hive wet, you don't want to get the hive wet, but also if it's overcast, honeybees are not going to go out. Very, very few will go out. And so you're just going to have that many more bees to deal with. I mean, in a strong colony, we can have anywhere from 20 to 60,000 bees in a hive. You want to make sure that you have as less as possible, to less disruption. So warmest time of the day, somewhere between probably 10 and 2 during the summertime, is when you typically would do that. So for all you people at work, that means that you can only do this on Saturday and Sunday, right? So that is another thing as a beekeeper to think about, is this management and how you're going to deal with working with your bees. I already answered how long a queen bee lives, and definitely be purchasing bees that are mite free. How do you use, or what do you use as a preventative for mites and moths? So moths, I don't know that I've ever seen a preventative for moths. They just, somehow they know where your hives are. And the way to do that is keeping a strong colony to be able to manage that, and then freezing equipment that you're not using. Freeze it and then put it away. That can manage. For mites, there are many products on the market. HopGuard is one that I've personally used. That's that they have they're like these strips of cardboard that you like fold over the frame, and so bees have to pass through it. It's really smelly and really messy. It's kind of dipped in this sauce, this goo that has hops, a hops derivative in it, and as they pass through this or alongside this cardboard, they get it on them, and it repels the moth, or it repels the mite, keeps them away. But there are other products on the market for mites as well. I can send out a copy of the slide, absolutely. What are you going to cover? Feeding. I'm going to cover bees. I'm going to cover feeding bees in the next presentation. Somebody asked if swarm cells or superseded cells should be removed during inspections. This is one way to manage them. You need to be managing swarms though. One way to do that is to divide your hive. That's kind of something I probably wouldn't recommend for a novice beekeeper, but you need to kind of be looking at how you do that. You always need to stay one step ahead of your bees. Like, what's the next thing that can happen? I need to learn how to do this so that if I see this case, I need to know how I'm going to manage this. So if trying to, you shouldn't, a supersedure cell, you shouldn't remove them unless you plan on buying a different queen and putting her in there. Because if you remove the supersedure cells, all they're going to do is create another one because they need a queen. Remember, a supersedure cell is usually in the instance that the queen is too young, or I'm sorry, too old, or that she's been lost or crushed or dead. So they are doing that in an emergency situation. Now, a swarm cell is something different. A swarm cell, you can actually utilize the cells on the bottom. If it's a queen that's developed and it's far enough along, you can actually put her in a new hive with other bees and start, these are ways that beekeepers can grow their amount of hives without having to buy new ones, right? So you want to use those swarm cells. You want to divide your hive. I've divided them. I think every year we've tried to divide. We've been maybe 60% success. It doesn't always work, but it does work a lot. And if you are diligent and do it, try to do it as correctly as possible, and the bees cooperate, which is often the question mark there. But so that's one way to hope I answer that question. I told about the time of year you collect the honey. Somebody asked if it's necessary to smoke bees when checking the hive. That is a highly debated question. If you ask 10 beekeepers, I'm sure you're going to get 11 different answers. For me, I use the smoker all the time. It works well for me. It distracts them, drives them away from the area that I'm trying to work, and it's much more efficient for me. Other beekeepers are strictly against smoke. They think it's terrible for your bees. That's fine for them. They have different ways of managing them. It's a personal preference as far as I'm concerned. Is it a bad situation to have dark comb in the brood box? Naturally in the brood box, you're gonna get dark comb just because it's being used. It's practice to replace your frames every couple years. When they get dark, replace them with new ones. It's often good to write on the top of your frame the year that you installed it so you know how old it is, and then you can rotate it out. That is a good method. You need to be replacing your dark comb. Somebody asked about my experience with, I don't know what a lay-in horizontal hive is. I cover that type of hive in the next presentation, but I don't run horizontal hives. I don't run those. They're, for me, they're too hard to manage, usually for new beekeepers, unless they have a mentor that is willing to really work with them. How many frames of brood should go with a new queen or a split? I would use the guideline of a nuke as a good guideline. About 5 is what I would say. Your hive should be in dappled sun. You want a little bit of dappled sun, probably not full sun. It'd be too hard for them to keep it cool enough in the hive. You want some dappled sun or some cold afternoon. Somebody asked if I recommended a screen if the hive is 10 feet from a neighbor's yard. You know, a thing of honey kind of makes good neighbors, so I would recommend doing that if you suspect that you might have a problem with your neighbors. You can put a screen on, yes. So I would probably, if it's only 10 feet away, yes, I would probably put a screen on, probably 8 to 10 feet tall. That way it forces the bees to come out and away. That can be one way, but it's not going to prevent them necessarily from your neighbors. If your neighbors have a pool, if they have something that is really attractive to bees, they're going to be over there. And then the last question is there time a hive should be open during an inspection? A maximum amount of time. would say the other way, just minimize the amount of time it's open. Keepers that we have to do that take time, it takes more time. But just realize the longer it's open, the more time you set them back. Every time you open the hive, it sets them back 3 days. So just kind of keeping that in mind, just trying to be in there minimal as possible. One thing that we've started to do, we open the box, and if we have to take the box off and set them aside, we will cover what's left just to kind of minimize bees that are coming out. So that is one method you can kind of try. Somebody else says that they have had their hive for 1 year, and they have one deep, and it seems very full and is thriving. How do we decide if we should add a second deep? So that's, Heather, that's that 7 of 10 rule. If you have 7 frames that are fully, have activity on them, you need to add a second one. And then when that gets 7 of 10 full, then you add your honey super. Corinna asked about Dappled Sun. Somebody said a sunshade. You can experiment with that. I know some beekeepers keep them in full sun. It's just the ideal situation is dappled shade. If you don't have it, you don't have it. So you can kind of try if you'd like. Yeah. I'm going to put up another poll, if you will. I'll stop sharing. Okay. If I can figure out how to do it. Hold on, we're going to have just kind of a quick little break here. I'll keep answering questions as they pop up. But I'd like to ask there's other questions here because I'm interested. If you could respond back, it's completely anonymous. I can't see your answers. Just interested on what you thought and of the first presentation, and then we'll start the second one here in about 5 minutes. And as you're kind of looking at that poll, somebody asked about swarm boxes. Should you put a swarm box out now or later? We're having some warm weather. We're just starting to kind of build up. We typically probably, you can put them out. I don't think it'll necessarily hurt. You'd have a little bit more luck putting them out in April though, when it starts to get a really warmer. Also, another tactic to kind of put in swarm boxes are a little bit of lemongrass oil. They seem to be really attracted to that scent, so that might be a strategy to use. Somebody asked about moving frames around within the box. For example, moving the empty ones on the ends toward the middle. This is also highly debated in beekeeping. Some people like to do that. They like to take because it tends to be kind of on the ends, the ones that are empty. They kind of like don't get to them unless they're forced to get to them. And so people will kind of put them in the middle to kind of force them to work on them. That is one thing people do. Some beekeepers say, would you like to go away and have your living room furniture rearranged and come back to that? So some people kind of give these qualities to bees that kind of like us. So it kind of depends upon you and what you think. My philosophy is to always experiment. And I have moved them around a little bit. It's worked, it hasn't worked. To me, it's kind of a wash, whatever you'd like. Sorry, that's maybe not a very good answer for you. I'm going to stop recording here.